You guys are so fortunate because it is incredibly rare to get the caliber of speakers that we have this afternoon in terms of their perspective and their insight into technology and engineering. So I'm excited to hear what you guys have to say, because just in our conversation as we were getting started, I thought it was so interesting, just misconceptions you have. And a big theme of our morning this morning is when you are coming from a different country, you have very little understanding of the Canadian labor market going into it. And so we want to give people an opportunity to sort of get a different perspective. So I'm just going to go through, quickly introduce our guests. Our first guest, to my immediate left, is Michael Thane. You are the Registrar and General Counsellor with ASTTBC, which is the Applied Science Technologists and Technicians of British Columbia. Is that correct?
You got it.
Excellent. Out of curiosity, how many professions does your association oversee?
Well, our primary registrants are applied science technologists and technicians, but we also have a group called the Registered Technical Specialists, and there's over 20 sort of trades within that group. We are trying to narrow it down to a little bit more of a smaller focus number, but so overall probably I'd say 5 or 6 really distinct sort of areas and trades. So.
Yeah. No, and I think that's great, and the narrowing down seems to make sense. But again, I think that when I talk to people about occupations, especially young people, they have such a narrow understanding of what occupations are out there to begin with. So I feel like an organization like the ASTTBC does a great job of saying, had you considered this? So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Beside Michael, we have Scott Phillips. Scott is the founder and CEO of Starfish Medical, and you're a past chair of Life Sciences BC. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And then we have 2 representatives from the BC Engineers and Geoscientists. First, we have Catherine Salkowski.
Yeah.
And you are the unauthorized practice investigator, so you're an engineer cop. I'm putting words in your mouth.
No.
I'm just joking, everybody.
Yeah, he's joking. I'm not.
But you look into unauthorized
That's
practice.
right. That's right. Yeah.
And then we have Karen Leung, and you are the manager of academic assessment with BC Engineers and Geoscientists.
That's right.
It's been how many years? And I always go to APEG BC. So It used to be the Association of Professional Engineers and Geoscientists.
Right.
And I don't know, I still am always stuck in that piece of
Fair
it.
enough.
So thank you, welcome everybody.
Thank you.
Why don't we just start off with Michael, if you're okay with that.
Sure.
Tell us a little bit about ASTTBC.
Sure. So I think we covered a bit. We have our primary registrants are technologists and technicians who work as part of the engineering team. They're usually doing some of the more field site sort of style work where they do some design, some assessment, some testing on site. We have been in association for 65 years now, and previously we were more of an association where we were more of an advocacy body and membership driven sort of role. In 2021, both ourselves and the engineers and geoscientists came under a new act called the Professional Governance Act, and that really is sort of redefined our role to be more of a regulator, which means we're there to regulate a profession on behalf of the government to make sure it serves the public interest at all times. And the parts of that are registration, complaints and discipline, ongoing practice. So that's our current role is as a regulator. So our job is to register people as a technologist, a technician, or one of the other technical specialties we have, make sure they meet a certain standard of competency, education, and experience to be registered, and then oversee that registrant to make sure they are accountable through a complaints and discipline process, and support them through practice standards and practice reviews and things like that. So it's really, we're a full regulator now. We don't do as much of the association advocacy work, but it's exciting nonetheless. So.
Okay. Excellent. Well, thank you. I've always felt that the EGBC and ASTTBC seem to be complementary in different occupations, but complementary occupations. So
very similar, yeah.
Scott, you are the founder and CEO of Starfish Medical, but you also have been past chair of Life Sciences BC.
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about Starfish Medical?
Okay, Starfish Medical is a design services company. So we're the largest in Canada that does that. It just focused on the medical technology area. About 200 staff based here, and also here like Victoria. That's that version of here, and also in Toronto.
Okay.
And so we design all sorts of cool things. We got many engineers, and we design things that go inside your body, things that do surgery, things that put things inside your brain. like an engineer's dream.
You know, I remember reading an article a few years ago and it talked about the billions of dollars worth of companies in British Columbia that have been spawned from research that was done at UBC specifically.
Yes.
That we have a great reputation within the biomedical sector.
Yes.
And obviously your company is in line with that.
Yeah, that's right. So we amplify companies wherever they are. Our target market's based in North America. But so they're we just signed a big new client in Philadelphia this week, for example. But we also work with Vancouver companies and companies from all over British Columbia and Canada.
So what is Life Sciences BC then?
Okay, let's flip in over the page to the LSBC portfolio. LSBC is an organization that supports the whole industry. It's and by that I mean the private companies, the government, universities, anybody who's contributing to the life science sector. So it's kind of interesting. We're not an industry association. We're more of a cross-sectoral organization.
Okay, excellent.
But we've got a little bit of government money, but mostly funded by our members' fees. So
But really speaking to the members, it needs.
yeah, that's right. Well, different organizations get compromised or challenged in different ways depending on where they get their money, right? So we have a lot of autonomy to do what we think is right for the sector.
That's interesting. Well, thank you for coming today.
Sure.
Is it Catherine or Kathy?
Either one. I'm
Okay.
good with either.
I apologize for calling you a engineering cop.
No, it's okay. Trust me, I've been called worse, so you can go ahead.
What is unauthorized practice investigation?
Okay, so in the province of British Columbia, you have to be registered with Engineers and Geoscientists BC if you want to practice the profession as a professional engineer or geoscientist. So people who might come to work in Canada, or BC I should say, that aren't registered with us but are doing work that we consider professional engineering need to get registered. And if they don't get registered, that's when I come in to try and get some compliance as it relates to moving them into registration. Karen's team and I work closely together. Our overall goal is not to be the cop. It's more so to be the assistant in moving people into compliance in a voluntary way. So my job is to say, you need to get registration or you need to stop what you're doing.
Yeah.
What we have in terms of unauthorized practice is the ability to take somebody or a company that hasn't obtained their permit to practice to the Supreme Court to get an injunction if the person or the firm or the company isn't working with us, and to move them into the compliance. And like Michael said, we are the authority given to us to do that is the Professional Governance Act. And that's where it defined the regulations, and that's where the profession of engineering is defined, and it lays out the disciplines of engineering in that scope.
And obviously the history of like accidents teaches us that regulating engineers is an incredibly important function in society.
Yeah, we have another side of Engineers and Geoscientists BC, which is an investigation side that investigates registrants and companies that have permits to practice. And that's a different process altogether than what I've just explained. My role is simply just to investigate companies or people that may be engaged in engineering work that aren't registered with us.
Yeah.
And engineering work is, you can be engaged in engineering work in British Columbia and not be a registrant. You have to be directly supervised by a registrant of EGBC if you're going to be doing professional engineering in BC. And then we have the title side of it. So when you can't call yourself an engineer in the province of British Columbia, defined as the regulations, the disciplines, without registration with us. But there is some context like we were talking about earlier. So if you call yourself, for example, a cupcake engineer, and there's nothing on your LinkedIn that indicates that you're an engineer, we might be fine with that, because it's not implying that you're engaged in engineering work. But if you call yourself an engineer and you're not registered with us, but you're working for an engineering company, so we're going to assume then that because you're working for this company that's engaged in engineering work, then you yourself are an engineer. You need to be registered with us in order to call yourself an engineer. Much like what we want to do is we want to increase public confidence in the engineering and geoscience disciplines, and so you can't call yourself a psychologist without being registered with the the
BC Clinical
association.
Counselors
Yeah, you
Association.
can't call yourself a police officer unless you're actually a police officer. So that's so that's how that goes. So so that's the other side of things is title usage, and the majority of our work comes from the title usage part. Yeah.
Karen, you are the manager of academic assessment with EGBC. Can you tell us about what your department does?
So I'm in the registration department. So we basically are the intake of all applications for trainees, so engineers in training, geoscientists in training, as well as for professional registrants, professional engineers, professional geoscientists, and we also have the professional licensee category for both engineering and geoscience. So we process the applications and help applicants through to registration.
Excellent. I'm going to go through again. If you feel as though you want to contribute to what anyone on the panel is saying, by all means, it doesn't need to be like a boom, 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 boom. And I'll try to mix it up as much as I can. But I thought maybe we'd start off with Michael. You said there's this spectrum of occupations. I don't want you to have to recite them all, but can you give us a sense of a lot of the roles that you regulate?
Sure. So I think I'll focus most on the technologists and technicians because that's probably the most internationally mobile sort of field. And as you said, there's a lot of sort of not overlap, but there's a lot of intersect between us and engineers because we are people who typically work as part of the engineering team. So our disciplines are very similar to engineering disciplines. They're allowed to engage in work. However, as was pointed out, you cannot do the practice of professional engineering without being a professional engineer and having a license with them. But you can engage under the supervision of an engineer in that sort of practice. That's typically what our people do. And we are also in the process currently of negotiating a reserved practice for technologists and technicians, which would be similar to engineering, but without going into engineering, saying if you're engaging in these activities as a technologist, you'll have to be a registered professional to do that. Our disciplines I listed them because I wouldn't be able to do them off the top of my head, believe it or not. We have architectural, building construction, bioscience, biomedical, chemical engineering, civil engineering, electrical engineering, electronic engineering, environmental engineering, petroleum and gas, geotechnical, industrial, information technology, instrumentation, marine engineering, mechanical, metallurgical, mineral, naval, and survey. So every time I meet one of our registrants and they tell me a bit of what they do, sometimes they do some very interesting things I never would have known about or that somebody actually does that job. So I'm sure very similar to engineering, there's a huge spectrum of work that our people engage in. So.
Well, I know this morning we ran sort of through a list of the types of engineers that we have in BC. I'm just curious, can you guys list how many different types of engineers you license? If you haven't, I didn't ask you ahead of time.
Well, I think in our regs we can list them off as well if you like.
Yeah,
probably very similar.
Here we go. So in our regulations, which is the professional government, we have agricultural, biomedical, bioresource, biosystems, building, chemical, civil, computer, electrical, environmental, food, forest, geological, geomatics, industrial, marine, mechanical, mechatronics, metallurgical, mining, naval architect, nuclear, petroleum, software, and structural engineering and engineering physics.
Wow, that's incredible.
And I'm not an engineer, so the fact that I said all of that without, is pretty good. Yeah, so that's the amount of,
And that's not even counting the geoscientist side of things.
No,
You don't
that's
have
not.
to go into
Yeah,
Disciplines.
they're three. Yeah, you can go with the three disciplines, please.
I'm not geophysics, environmental, geoscience, and I'm sorry, I'm not too familiar with the geoscience side of things.
That's fine. I was just curious. Scott, what kind of engineers do you employ?
Lots of different kinds.
Yeah.
I'm myself an engineering physicist, grad from UBC. We have many internationally trained engineering grads, mechanical, electronics, software. We have a lot of industrial designers and human factors. Some of the human factors people are registered or are engineering degreed as well. There's probably a few others, but they cross a lot of boundaries when you're designing a brand new medical device.
I don't know if any of you could address or answer this effectively. I remember encountering a number of years ago, I would regularly meet internationally trained immigrants who were chemical engineers. And it seems like most chemical engineers in Canada are employed back east. Is that incorrect? Or is there some validity to that?
I feel like we register quite a few chemical engineers. Yeah.
Speaking, we've talked about immigrants. Do you feel as though we've gotten better in the last few years about creating easier pathways for immigrants to come into technology and technician and engineering roles in British Columbia? Anybody? This is free fall.
I guess I can start since we spoke about this very briefly. So I was explaining that there's a misconception that the 1 year of Canadian experience is still a requirement, and I can't say when exactly, but that did change a while ago. So in place of that, when an applicant submits their experience through the online competency-based assessment system, there are about, I think, 34 indicators, of which about 8 of them are flagged as Canadian environment indicators. This doesn't mean that that experience needs to have taken place within Canada. It just means that you need to try and relate the experience internationally with the Canadian requirements. So for example, if the indicator is asking about your knowledge of Canadian codes and standards, you might cite the applicable codes in whichever country that you've worked in, and then relate it back to the applicable Canadian code to demonstrate that you have the understanding of which codes would apply in a Canadian environment.
Any other thoughts? Like, because you said you employ a number of international.
We do, yeah. It's interesting that the regulatory shifts that have been that happened recently, I think, have been challenging for the international immigrants, because the scope of professional engineering was de facto quite narrow previously, and now it's very wide. So we're having discussions about just how wide they should be. And I won't get into all that today, but I do think that we'll find a spot. Ultimately, we'll find a spot where the appropriate places for professional engineering type standards will apply to public safety, and probably some other things will be excluded. So.
Yeah, and I think maybe just to echo sort of what's been said is I think there's been a real push really across Canada on a provincial level to recognize that we haven't done a great job of recognizing internationally trained people who are probably qualified to do the work. So I know Ontario's had legislation that really prohibits that, the Canadian work experience requirements, and also to improve the process for people who have foreign credentials to get those recognized in Canada. I know it's a government priority, and I think a lot of us regulators have, I think EGBC and ourselves are both, EGBC certainly I think was ahead of us on it, but we're ahead of the curve in at least getting our requirements in line with that, to say, okay, how can we do a better job to make sure people aren't having unnecessary barriers to doing work they're qualified to do. So I think there's going to be a lot more change in that area, I think, as time goes on. I think we see a lot in the news about the medical industry, and especially because there's a shortage of doctors, and you hear how many doctors are here trying to get licensed to work. So that's a very visible one, but I think it's industry-wide. It's just not as visible in maybe engineering and technology work.
Well, and I think that visibility is a big part of the question. We've had for many years, we talk about STEM occupations, which is science, technology, engineering, and mathematics occupations. If you want to add artistic occupations into it, which I have an issue with, and maybe I'm alone in this, but I feel like, yes, we do need people to go into artistic occupations as well, but then let's just put together the whole alphabet, because there's lots of jobs we want people to go into. And I feel like what's important about STEM occupations is, for people who know what's right for them, they're committed to it from a very young age. And that there are lots of people who could be great in STEM occupations. They're just not really aware of where the opportunities are. And I'm curious, because we've talked about immigrants, but do you feel as though, and I'll ask you first, Michael, do you feel like we do a good job of talking to young people about technician and technologist roles?
I think there's definitely a push to make those occupations more recognized. I, just for background, don't come from a STEM background. I come from a legal background. And up until 2 years ago when I joined the organization, I had to find out what a technologist was and what they did. So that maybe tells you that, we weren't doing the best job, because I was Googling what's a technologist, what do they do? And, they do a lot. And I find out how much different work they engage in and how pervasive it is in everyday life, along with engineering. So I think we've recognized that. We are making a push to really promote, like, what is the, there is professional engineering, but there's also a lot of jobs that are part of that realm that aren't necessarily being a professional engineer if that doesn't suit your skill set or your educational goals. So I think it's more of a push to, and we have been trying to promote awareness by finding individual registrant stories and having those be delivered to the public so people understand, hey, here's a career you might not have known about.
Well, the career counselor in me says that there are certain skills that people have, natural skills. And if we can identify those natural skills early on, then we can talk to them about different roles. I'm curious, from the life sciences perspective, do you feel like people, like the average person in British Columbia, has a good sense of what the life sciences sector is?
I think they don't. You're talking about very broadly across the whole province and all the high schools and things like that, right?
Yeah.
I think it's becoming much more known. We now have something like 30,000 people working in our sector, so a lot of people have aunts and uncles and parents and so on who are working in the sector. But I don't think people realize you can make a good, solid career in this space in Vancouver. And there are lots of companies that work in pharma or biotech. Or there was a thing maybe about 3 years ago where there was a local company that's originally spun out of UBC that was making very esoteric machines to identify antibodies, which for most people they don't know what an antibody is. And a few years ago I didn't know what it was either. Then they found a big application to go after finding these things for pharma companies and doing deals with them, and they actually took their company public and became worth $16 billion. So that, you can imagine that. But that was the largest IPO maybe in Canadian history. I don't know, but it was gigantic. Got attention all over the world. The fact that you can do that here means you have to have a lot of complementary specialists of all different kinds to be able to do that, and very brave and bold finance people and marketing people and everything, right? So it's not just engineers. It's the engineers are maybe the root of it, but it leverages into many, many other things.
That seems to be one of the biggest factors these days for large, especially technology companies choosing to move to British Columbia or Ontario or Quebec. Is there a local talent pool that has the skills that we're going to need in order to have operations in Canada?
Yeah, I mean, in our sector, we recruit from all over the world. Like but we'd rather hire people here. They're already here, already know the culture, already can get around. They already have a place to live and all that kind of stuff, right?
Karen, Kathy, do you feel like, obviously engineering is a more known quantity for, I think, young people. Do you think that people have been, I think just the diversity you were talking about earlier in terms of the occupations, engineering occupations, but do you feel like we do a good job of introducing young people to this?
Sorry, maybe you can speak on the mentors or
You go ahead. Karen, the engineer, will speak.
I feel like there isn't a good understanding of what engineers do, even amongst adults. You're an engineer. Oh, what do you do? Or, I used to work for this place. Oh, do they do this? Not quite. So, yeah, we could probably be doing a better job. And then I don't know if you want to speak about the school outreach that we were doing.
We did have an outreach program between K and 12 where we would kind of the educators would connect with our engineers and geoscientists, and we would work with the schools and those. But to Michael's point, we're sort of shifting away from. We're becoming more of a regulatory body per se, and unfortunately, that means that there are certain programs that we did have that are going to be ending, and that's one of them. So, we have to sort of refocus because we've been ordered to refocus, and therefore, so now we're looking at having to be more of a regulatory body than all of that outreach that we were doing before.
I think that is very common for lots of professions. You have the BC Nurses Union, but you have the Nurses College, you have the Doctors of BC and the Royal College of Physicians. So are you guys being regulated out of having any sort of association focus, both organizations?
Go ahead.
It is. We do have rules because we are under government oversight now about what we're allowed to do, and they have given us guidelines on what kinds of advocacy can we do. Some is permitted, but a lot of that sort of, I'd say, the fun advocacy of doing the outreach and stuff. Unfortunately, something that's not our focus anymore. And I know engineers are having a spin-off association to hopefully take some of that over, and we're hoping that's something we're going to probably engage into, is to pass on. I think it's important work, but it's just different work. So.
Well said.
As an outsider, that's disappointing because I know when I try to engage any regulatory body, it's like iron gates that they don't want to talk to the public at all.
Can I speak to that?
Yeah,
Because I
absolutely.
do experience the feedback from people that I work with in terms of my investigations. And one thing I want to preface is that I think, having spent some time here even today, that you can call us and we can help you. And if you have a question about, is this unauthorized practice or is this engineering work or can I call myself this, please phone. To your point, do you get that iron wall? Well, we're trying to fix that.
Yeah.
So we may not be able to provide that program for you, but we will definitely try to point you in the right direction and definitely try to move whatever questions you have into the right spot. I know registration's incredibly good about responding. I try to respond as quickly as possible to questions I get. So we are trying to fix that for sure. It is a goal of ours, yeah.
Out of curiosity, because I know that your association has always been and it was an association,
Yeah.
that's what we were
Yeah.
known for. I know there's a lot of smaller affiliations of different types of engineers. Is there a provincial alternative if there isn't that opportunity to act as sort of an advocacy group and as a networking group and that sort of thing?
So I probably should have mentioned that every year in January, LSPC puts on a thing called Career Connect Day,
Yeah.
where it's specifically for people looking for careers in the sector, and many companies come out. It's a place for any sort of grads of technology programs. It's not for high school students at that level, but it's more for people who move to Canada and are looking to stay in the field or are just finished their PhD and now they're trying to figure out who to work with and that sort of thing. So,
Well, we'll share that with everybody here because I think that's a great opportunity. Yeah. Any other thoughts about that sort of that advocacy networking piece? How that looks like moving forward?
It's in early stages. They are looking to form a separate advocacy body, and I think they're recruiting now for the board of that advocacy body. So it's all very new.
Is ASTTBC a similar situation?
There is an association that has started. I think it's very early days. We weren't part of the formation of it, but there are bodies out there that certainly, as we refine our role too, and we look at who are we actually going to regulate moving forward, because as I said, we're trying to focus on, we had 23 of these technical specialties. Not all of them probably justify regulation, so we are trying to say, how do we focus this down onto who needs to actually be regulated? Because generally the underpinning is there has to be a public safety risk for you to regulate someone. But as we do that, we're looking at alternatives to say, okay, if we're not going to have you regulated, maybe you want to form an association to still do the work that is relevant to your job. Yes, but...
Well, that's kind of actually my next question, Scott. How important is networking collaboration within the technology sector? Because we talked a little bit about mentorship earlier today. I'm a huge fan of mentorship. I think that's a great way for people who are new to the country particularly. But do you feel like that's one of sort of our unique strengths, is that we are oriented towards networking and collaboration, both on a corporate level and as an individual level?
certainly within companies, that's always, I think that's the work culture that we have in British Columbia is very much a collaborative mentorship kind of a culture, trying to grow people up in their careers. And then within LSBC, of course, we have many events where people can come to meet, collaborate, and find people they can get coached by, or all sorts of things. Just meet, get to know socially. I think that's how you develop in your career, right?
Yeah.
And that's how you find opportunities. And I think there's another aspect, which is that a lot of our industry here is really entrepreneurial in nature. These are companies that have grown up here, and they started very small, so they still have that atmosphere of enterprise about them. And I think it's important to maintain that, and and normalizing that culture of trying stuff is, I think, an important function that LSBC and as an entrepreneurial community that we try to support.
I know that when I've looked at the stats, I'm amazed by the number of technology companies in BC that have less than 10 employees. Because you think of, like I said to everyone earlier, when you think of technology companies, you think of TELUS or Rogers or Electronic Arts and things like that. These sort of big companies, and yet there's a lot of small companies doing a lot of sort of niche things.
There are within our sector. There are a few of those. There's a lot of companies in the sort of 50 employee sort of range. That are doing some magical, important thing. And I could list them all off, that whatever the magical thing.
It's a
there-
technical term, right?
Yeah, that's,
Important thing?
I try to be extremely technical and precise in my words, yes. Companies like, there's a company named Cardium that's trying to make a catheter. It goes inside your heart and ablates part of it to get rid of atrial fibrillation, for example.
Mm-hmm.
And, you can't do that with 10 people. Or there's a company called Clarius, that's a type of mobile handheld ultrasound machine that they're developing, that they're selling all over the world. But they're all people who graduated from school here, made relationships here across the community, and decided, okay, now's the time to start this thing, right?
Well, I know, my mother-in-law does dialysis at home, which
Yeah.
is something that would have been impossible once upon a time, but she can now
Mm-hmm.
do. A few years ago, I was interviewing the people director at Vancouver Coastal Health, and I said what I often think in my own brain, which is, how does it work? We have this huge population of people going to retire. They're the biggest taxpayers in the country. We don't have the same population of young people coming into the job market. How do we do this as our population ages and we need ever-increasing amounts of healthcare? And she said technology. That technology is a pathway to eliminating enormously labor-intensive medical practices.
Yeah, that's particularly if you look at where the money is spent on over the course of your life. You're going to spend a big chunk of it in the last year or two of your life, right?
Yeah.
That's where the statistics say. So I was on a committee earlier with the provincial government trying to say, how can we either delay or push better care out to the home so people can not have to go live in long-term care? Because they were very concerned, well, how are we going to build all these thousands of long-term care spots we're only going to need for a while? Technology does solve it to some extent, but it's much more than that.
Oh yeah, absolutely. But she's saying that this is an important part of that equation.
Yeah, sure.
Do engineers do a good job of networking in this province in terms of mentoring and networking?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, there are various conferences within companies. There are mentorship programs. We have a mentorship program as well, which is geared specifically towards assisting applicants and trainees through the registration process. So they're paired with a professional registrant. And then just through course offerings and things, I feel like there's quite a bit of networking that happens there.
Something I'm curious about, is it hard to find engineers who have the time to mentor people? Because every engineer I've ever met is incredibly busy.
No, that's true. I mean, where I used to work, we had a mentorship program, and I think there wasn't really a problem finding mentors.
Excellent. I'm curious in terms of, sorry, I need to read my questions. Michael, I'll start with you. In terms of the technicians and technologists of BC, what are the roles that employers are struggling to find people to go into?
I'm not sure about struggling. I know across the board we have seen a decrease in registrations. That's due to, I think, the demographics of a lot of people in the baby boomer generation are retiring, so there's a lot of empty. I think across the board we've noted it.
So there's people who are retiring, they're coming off the registry, and there's not as many
necessarily
people coming on.
in. So I think across the board there's certainly a decrease overall. So I don't think there's any place that's oversupplied for people in certain disciplines. I think you can look at some of the government priorities at the moment. Obviously, housing's nationally and provincially, especially. There's announcements now they want so many thousands of houses built in the next 5 years. I think that's a pretty good indicator that there'll be some pretty good work for the next 5 years. I don't know if we have the capacity for that. So I think that'll be and that sort of lines up with what our biggest disciplines are. Most of our registrants are in the civil engineering discipline, as well as some of those supporting ones like mechanical, electrical. So I think architectural, those are all areas I think we're going to need just through government sort of indications are going to need people.
Yeah.
But across the board, I don't think there's any one industry that's bad to go into.
No. And that makes sense to me. I just, the challenge I think is that, yes, the construction priorities are well stated, but every sector, teachers, I would never have thought that we would be short teachers in British Columbia, because we talk about people going into occupations because they're well known to them. For many years, we trained about 3 or 4 times as many teachers as we would hire in a typical year. And I remember talking to people who would run teaching programs at the local universities, and they would say, yeah, but our students find employment, not necessarily as teachers, but they find employment elsewhere. And so then we end up in a situation where we have a shortage of teachers, we have a shortage of engineers, we have a shortage of culinary arts people. Like, there is shortages in every conceivable sector, not the least of which is the Surrey Police Department. Like, it's in every sector. And so then it becomes a issue of professions being able to attract people. You know, Scott, do you have any roles that you find, like, when we hire for this, we get tons of applicants, when we hire for that, it's really hard for us?
Interestingly, about 6 months or so ago, we were getting no applicants for our roles, even though we think we're the coolest company going. But
That's what I hear. Word on the street is.
And now we're getting lots. So it's I don't totally understand the labor market, whether maybe people in the post-COVID era were still kind of afraid to move or just wanted to hang on to what they had. And now they're starting to feel they can breathe again, and literally, and find other stuff. But you know, it's always hard. I mean, we right now have a deficit in our sector of all sorts of people, from production techs, marketing people, R&D engineers, field support engineers, all different kind of engineers. But part of the challenge is you're looking for very particular people, right? Mm-hmm. You don't just say, "Hey, you're an engineer. Come on in. We got a job for you."
Yeah.
It's got to be the right kind of engineer, the right kind of background, right kind of personality to match the right kind of role. And engineering is one of those areas where it's like an apprenticeship. You can't really learn how to do engineering from a book.
Yeah.
You have to learn from other people, which I think is a lot of the impetus for having such a well-established regulatory framework as EGBC to recognize that.
Do you guys notice anecdotally that there are some engineering roles that are in greater demand than others?
I can't say specifically. Registration-wise, we have been seeing a steady increase in application volumes just over the years steadily. Most are the traditional disciplines that Michael mentioned, like electrical, civil, mechanical. But with our industry here, we also see quite a few like marine applicants. But I can't speak to where the needs are in the industry specifically.
You know, it's interesting because I feel like each of you have sort of touched on this to a certain degree. In Canada, I believe our goal for immigration last year was 450,000 people, and we saw nearly 1 million people come to Canada. We said the population grew by 1 million people, 97% of which was immigrants. Mm-hmm. And so we have that 450,000 traditional immigrants, but then we also had, I think, 250,000 immigrants from the Ukraine. We had temporary foreign workers, we had international students, and of course refugees. And it sounds like that, because that's what I think. We had 1 million job openings last spring, like spring before last, 2022. Mm-hmm. And now that's down to about 650,000 job applications. And so what I'm hearing from lots of employers is, yeah, we were able to ease things out in the last year. And it sounds like immigrants was a big part of that. Does that sound correct?
If I look at my staff, there's a lot of immigrants in there, so I have to imagine that there's some truth to that. I haven't actually tried to map out their stories and what year they came to Canada and so on. But
I'd say similarly on like just a subjective basis of what we've observed within our organization is, yeah, when we post a role, we've been hiring. I think almost all of our recent hires have been new immigrants with an engineering background. So
interesting.
It's just from that sort of small perspective.
Yeah.
We haven't hired a ton of people in the past year, but the ones we have been primarily immigrants.
And I would say over 50% of our newly registered PN registrants are internationally trained.
Interesting. And the other 50% would be young people who've just completed their studies.
Well, locally, I guess, within Canada.
Yeah, interesting. You know what? You made me wonder about something. Do we have many people coming from the provinces?
Yes, we do.
Oh,
yeah,
okay.
Yeah. Sometimes they apply as mobility applicants in that they're already registered as an EIT or PN or geoscientist in another province, and then they want to apply to BC because everyone seems to want to move here despite the high cost.
It's a great place. We all chose to live in BC. I'm curious. There was something on your website that I was curious about, Michael, and I'm going to ask you about it. What is the new application handbook for internationally trained applicants?
Sure. So that was a resource we developed to really lay out what the requirements are for somebody with international experience, because before that they could look at our website and look at the general requirements and try to figure out how do they meet them as an international applicant. But we thought it'd be helpful to have a resource that really just said, speaking to somebody with international credentials, here's what the process is for you. So there's no worrying about having to navigate your way through a bunch of policy and bylaws and procedures. It really just says, here's how you meet the equivalency, here's the pathway to registration. I will note we are in the process of changing our registration process quite significantly.
Okay.
Part of it was we just recently removed that Canadian work experience requirement, and we were looking at ways to really make it more transparent, objective, and fair for international applicants to become registered. That will be updated probably in about 6 weeks. So we're just in the process of implementing those changes. But really what the goal is to have it so people who are internationally trained while they're working on their immigration application will be able to complete almost all of the registration requirements prior to arriving to Canada. So that when they do arrive, they can arrive on Friday and be registered on Monday.
That's great.
So that was our goal with these new requirements that we're pushing in. But it's to really make it just a much more straightforward process.
Nice. You know, I love the responsiveness of what you've all talked about in terms of recognizing there's a changing landscape and sort of dealing with it. One of the debates I get into people, so I work with employment and career centers all around British Columbia, and I'll talk to somebody in Nanaimo or in Prince George or in Penticton or Vernon or something like that, and they'll be like, well, we really want labor market information for Vernon or Penticton. And I'd be like, well, that's great, and you guys are in a great place to look for that. But when it comes to occupations, there's always so much change that happens with occupations. And that's the hard thing for career counselors to stay on top of, is to recognize that, like you say, the 1 year is no longer a reality, and yet lots of people believe it. And sort of how your process has changed as well. Like just staying on top of, because according to Stats Canada, there's about 30,000 different occupations a person can go into. So being able to stay on top of that is a huge challenge. I'm curious, actually, I just need to look at my notes again. So you talked about outreach changing. There's something that's listed on the website called School Outreach and Awareness Programs. So are those continuing?
No, not with us, unfortunately. Yeah.
Okay.
As of next year. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Again, I think this is really important. Like, we want to talk about people. You know, something I'm curious about, because you're an engineer, and one thing I notice is that in the construction industry, like if I go to UBC and I go to the law school, more than 50% are women. If I go to the medical school, more than 50% are women. I have read that among engineers, it's about 33 to 35%. Does that sound accurate?
I would say it's lower than that because Engineers Canada has a 30 by 30 initiative.
Okay.
So by the year 2030, 30% of the engineers registered in Canada will be female.
So presumably about 25% then.
Yeah. I couldn't say for sure,
Okay,
but
couldn't say
less
for
than
sure.
30. And it's probably higher in school.
Yeah.
It starts to drop off once women enter their career.
You know, and that's the thing that I've also read, is that because women take time out of the labor force for a lot of family-related reasons, women, when you look at the workforce, it's smaller too because of that. If I look at the construction industry is about 55-45, but among the 45%, most of the women are working off the construction site. On the construction site, women make up about 5% of workers. And so I'm curious why in medical school and law school, we'd have over 50% of students being women. Engineering, 25%, if that's what it is, wouldn't be ideal, but it's a lot higher than 5%. And so my bigger question is, do you think that we, sort of a two-pronged question, do you think we do enough to encourage women to become engineers? And do you feel like engineering still has a ways to go to make it an environment that women want to work in?
No and yes. So again, it comes down to like the awareness. I think a lot of people, regardless of gender, end up in engineering school because they know someone who was an engineer. Their dad was an engineer, their mom was an engineer. There's not really a good awareness of engineering as a career and what the options are, and is not really promoted. And then there's always this stigma at very early ages about math. Like, math is hard, I hate math, I can't do
That
math.
Barbie.
And
Well, you don't know that. Barbie, anyway, I don't even know.
So I think that's something we need to overcome as well. And in terms of attracting women to the profession, I guess a lot of it is awareness. Definitely I have thoughts on keeping them in, which I'd rather not go into today. But in terms of attracting them, I'm not sure what would be needed to do that.
I'm not an engineer, but I'm a woman working for Engineers Geoscientists BC. And I will say I came from a law enforcement background, so predominantly I'm older too. So a lot when they were younger, a lot of men in my previous professions. Coming to EGBC, I have to say our CEO is a woman, Heidi, and she's a big champion, as is Karen, of the 30/30 initiative, and collaborating with the industries across Canada to increase our women registrants. And I'm pretty proud of EGBC's move in that direction, and I think it's because we have some really great women who work for us and do a great job in propelling that aspect of our EDI forward,
Now, I'm curious, do you see a lot of women going into technology and technologist roles, or technician and technologist roles?
We do see a fair number, but I would say it certainly probably tracks very similarly to what the engineers are describing, where I think that there is that, I don't know if it's a cultural shift that, but there's something somewhere on the line that's causing it to sort of be more attractive or discourage women from being involved. We did do a study, I think, about 3 or 4 years ago called Advancing Women in Engineering Technology that was really looking at that issue, and that's on our website. There's some interesting data on that, but I think as I can't remember if it was Catherine or Carolyn who said, but I think one of those things was the math. It's like there's this sort of stigma around certain sciences, like if I don't find that enjoyable or if I discourage from getting engaged in that really causes people to sort of step back from that whole realm of STEM. So I think there's a lot to be done there early on, especially to get more engagement.
Yeah, even in schools, we saw a trend of like the highest percentage of females would be in certain disciplines and the lowest were always in certain disciplines.
Interesting. I feel like it's a sector that needs, because I think one of you talked about women champions, like that there needs to be leaders and there needs to be mentorship, and I think that's where the construction industry falls off, is because there's a large percentage of women who leave construction within 1 year of going into a construction job. And they almost always cite work environment as a major factor in deciding to leave, like percentage compared to men. And because it's 5%, because on a construction site you are the one woman to 19 other men, it can be a really toxic environment a lot of the time. And so I think that employers also need to be advocates. And like the head of the British Columbia Skilled Trades BC is a woman. Like there are women in a lot of key leadership roles.
I would add on to our CEO is also a woman, so I think there's certainly in those higher level roles you're starting to see that be reflected, which I think is a great place to make change, is to have somebody in that position to advance it and who understands it. So.
Well, I'm going to ask my last question to the four of you, and then we'll open it up for questions if you guys have questions. How do you feel about the future of technology in British Columbia? Like how, and this is sort of your personal perspective on things.
Sure, I can. One big change for us as an organization will be getting what's called a reserve practice, or saying similar to what EGBC already has, where you have to be a registered to engage in a certain scope of work. So there's one other province in Canada, New Brunswick, that has that currently, and hopefully we're on that path right now, working with EGBC and the government on that. So that's going to be a very significant change when that comes in, and I think it'll really make it a safer province for the public, because there's a lot of people in some key roles that are not having proper oversight right now. So the idea is to improve that, and I think that'll really help improve public safety for British Columbia. So.
It's interesting because things like this happen all the time. Like we just recently, talk about occupations changing, we just licensed asbestos remediation. And so previously there were rules, but anybody could abate asbestos. But anytime you regulate an occupation, it's great for people who work in that occupation. And I think about crane operators. Previously, to be a crane operator in British Columbia, you didn't need a license, but lots of things were falling from the sky. And they said, okay, well, WorkSafe BC is going to step in and they're going to regulate, you have to license crane operators. It made it safer for all of us, but also it constrained the pool of available talent. And so those people got better working conditions, higher wages, more job security. And so I'm a huge fan of regulating occupations, because I feel like we end up with a safer province, and people have more secure employment.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, because when something's unregulated and it needs a person who maybe has a very strong education and skill set, and the employer has the option to go with somebody who might be cheaper and not have that
Yeah.
education and skill set and experience that might be necessary, is that it takes away that attractiveness to hire an unregulated person. So
Well, despite the fact that truck drivers keep driving into overpasses, we've licensed truck drivers. So previously, you could write your Class 1 driver's license and you didn't need to have any training whatsoever. And now we have mandatory entry-level training for truck drivers. So,
Yeah.
Scott, how do you feel about the future? Obviously, as an entrepreneur, you must feel great about it.
Well, I feel great about some things. I don't love that it costs a lot of money to live here.
Yeah.
And when you bring somebody even from like Dallas or something, they look at the cost of housing. They say, "Oh my God, it's like,"
Yeah.
and I can't deduct it off my taxes and whatever, all that. But LSBC just did a labor market study and showed that our sector has grown about 27% in the last 5 years, and that's the highest in Canada amongst life science sectors, and the second highest in BC amongst all the sectors. So you can project that forward. We have about 30,000 employed now. We think that probably bumps up to about 40,000 in 5 years.
Yeah.
But so where are those 10,000 people going to come from? That's just the companies that kind of exist now. And I'm very interested in the entrepreneurial environment. How do you make it really easy for people to start companies that involve technology? And that's really the basis of our discussions around scope and so on. So.
Just from your perspective, I'm curious about one thing. Government likes to encourage certain industries. Obviously, life sciences is a great industry. Do you think government understands life science?
Well,
And I'm not talking about this
think
government,
under
but the government
the
generally.
previous government,
Yeah.
they didn't even have life sciences on their list of anything. So now they understand it a great deal. It's thanks to some wonderful successes. It's not unusual to have big public announcements of companies going public and so on, and big stories that get everybody's attention. So it's definitely on the radar now. We have direct relationships with all the appropriate ministers and so on, so that to make sure that the policy frameworks are set up in ways that help.
Excellent. Kathy, how do you feel about the future?
As a non-engineer,
Future of engineering.
as a non, from an investigator's perspective, I feel that it's been I've been with EGBC for almost 2 years. Part of that, investigating other government in regulatory rule, and I would say that one of the things we want to do is first and foremost is protect society, and our protective purposes and the professional governance that speaks to that. And so I think we're doing a really good job of that. I think there's more we can do, and we're working together with the other regulatory bodies to ensure that not just bridges are built properly or dams or tailings dams are managed appropriately, but further and foremost, just supporting the regulatory framework that we have. And public safety is part of it, but it's also, our protective purposes speak to the environment, speak to, financial impact. You write an NI 43-101 and you talk about, that's a mining pre-feasibility report.
We all knew that.
Yeah. You're saying this particular area is a great mine, and to invest in it, and the company comes along because of that and invests hundreds of thousands of dollars, and then it was not great information. So that speaks to our protective purposes as well. It's not just safety critical work, it's also a financial aspect of it as well. So it's fascinating for me. I'm learning a lot as I move forward my career here with engineers and geoscientists. Yeah.
That's really
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Karen, how do you feel about the future of technology and engineering?
Yeah, I think the role of engineers will become increasingly important in contributing to the continuation of modern society. There already, as we heard, are a lot of disciplines within engineering, so the scope of practice is very broad and is always evolving. So, from your traditional disciplines around the built environment and infrastructure, we're constantly seeing emerging disciplines as well.
Yeah.
I just like to say for the record that I am fully in favor of safe bridges and dams. I
Me
feel like
too. Me
they are
too.
critical. want to thank you, all of you, for coming out today. I really appreciate your time. We'll link back your organizations to everybody who attends today. Just thank you so much. And I know that the roles of ASTDBC and EGBC are changing, but I appreciate you doing this community advocacy piece. So thank you, and thank you so much for showing up today.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Pleasure.
Thank you, guys.